Tonight's speaker is a scientist and project manager whose research interests are metabolic diseases, vascular, respiratory, inflammatory, autoimmune disease, HIV, AIDS research, Alzheimer's, soft and hard tissue repair and regeneration, small and large molecule drug discovery. Our speaker tonight has published many peer-reviewed articles in numerous journals, such as Nature, Cell, Human Gene Therapy, and Nature Drug Discovery. He is a Fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Biology, and a member of our Society. In 2009, he was awarded the title of Fellow of the Royal Society of Biology for outstanding contributions to bioscience. And in 2012, he was a recipient of the Alumnus Achievement Award from the University of Salford for distinction in science. Our speaker tonight holds qualifications from the University of Central Lancashire and Open University in cosmology, astronomy, planetary science, and astrobiology. He's passionate about astronomy and outreach, delivering many popular lectures to a wide range of societies, aimed at inspiring the present generation as well as future generations. So here for you tonight, having successfully enticed tonight's speaker away from his to-die-for home observatory to deliver the lecture, Lunar Dust, Challenges for Agriculture and Human Health, please welcome Dr. Martin Braddock.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks for the introduction. I wonder where he is, that person. I can't see him.
I think he's late, isn't he?
But actually, just thinking about courses and things, I've just completed, I don't know if anybody looks at the Liverpool John Moores University site, but I was a bit bored over the summer, and I just completed their high energy astrophysics course, which I think is about 5-6 months long. And it's, you know, the maths in it is fairly basic, so it's not too intense, but it's really interesting and really good fun to do. So if anybody wants something to do throughout the winter months, I think the next one starts, I think it starts next June, but there's a little bit of preparatory work to do. Have a look at the Liverpool John Moores University short courses tab on their Astrophysics Institute. So let's see if the technology works. We did earlier, and we'll start. So, and then if I put that on screen show, can everybody see that okay?
It's good for me.
Great. Okay, so entitled this Lunar Regolith, Challenges for Agriculture and Human Health. And saw this wonderful picture on the internet, so I thought that actually just about summarizes the bulk of what I'll mention in the next hour or so. But there's a few twists in the tale as we go. So when you think about maybe lunar regolith or the lunar surface, I think this automatically comes to mind, this beautiful image of Earthrise from the first lunar landing, Apollo 69. But then when you study the lunar surface in a little bit more detail, you can see that it's not perhaps as craggy as you might expect, but you can also see, just looking at that, it's telling you that there is dust on the surface and that it's not a compacted surface where you might expect to see no dust and no possible dust elevation should it be disturbed. When I look at that, I automatically think that looks like a dusty surface to me. So just by way of an outline, I thought I'd introduce a few things. First of all, just to define what lunar regolith is, because it may not be obvious to everybody, what it's made of, why and how we can study it. So why would we want to in the first instance? And then how can we? Can we grow plants in it? And of course, that's very topical when we think of the potential recolonization or at least resettlement of the moon. What might it do to human beings? How can we protect ourselves? And then maybe we can dwell a little bit on are we going back to the moon? And I should say that everything in here is at least up to date until about the end of September, beginning of October. There have been a few publications since then, and I know what they are now, but I've included pretty much everything that's up to date until then. So the little photo micrograph on the right-hand side is from NASA, and this is a typical particle of lunar regolith. And when you look at that, so this is 100 microns, as you can see the scale bar at the bottom. When you look at that, you can see that that is at a very heterogeneous sized particle. Multiple particles are composed in it, and you can see that that would probably be quite an interesting particle if it were to be compressed to maybe generate air gaps and maybe stick to clothing, maybe generally irritable if it was to be inhaled or get into your eyes. And we'll go into that in a lot more depth over the next 45 minutes or so. So what is lunar regolith, first of all? So lunar regolith is really just the fine covering and dust that we find on the surface of the moon. And it's derived from the Greek word, as you can see at the bottom, regos, blanket, and lithos, rock. So it's that fine covering of rock. And I took this photograph off one of the NASA web pages, the Apollo 15 lunar surface exploration. And I'm never ceased to be amazed by the quality of the images nearly 50 years ago. And when you look at the images at the bottom there, I've got mine expanded here on a 22-inch Mac, and it almost looks as if you could step into that fantastic quality image. But at the first glance, you can see that there are footprints in it, and it's maybe not too dissimilar from what we would expect to see on a beach, or maybe if it was to rain heavily in our gardens. So it's this fine powdery surface, and you can see here this is another image from an Apollo 16 mission where they're actually raking it, and the resolution is a little bit lower here because the image is magnified. But nearly the entire lunar surface is covered in this regolith, and the bedrock is only visible usually at the sides of steep craters that, of course, we all know and love when we look at the moon. So it's estimated to extend down to about 4 to 5 meters, and as deep as 15 meters in some of the older highland areas. And when you trawl back through some of the notes that were put together on the preparation for the early Apollo missions, there was real concern that when the lunar module would land on the surface of the moon, that it would either sink into the regolith or in some cases actually disappear completely. So there was no way of knowing, at that time at least, would the surface be rock solid, so to speak, no pun intended, or would there be a surface layering of regolith for which the legs of the lunar module would sink into. So when you look in a little bit more detail, and this is courtesy of David Kring at the Lunar and Planetary Institute, regolith itself, when it's broken down, is quite an interesting mix of particles. So there's anorthosites composed of basalt and breccia and glass spherules, agglutinates, but it's the glass spherules of either vitrophiles, green in color or orange in color, that automatically, when you think about comparing that with the structure of dust on Earth, might make you think about silica, might make you think about asbestos. And then, of course, we know what's associated with fine particles of glass in silica and certainly fine particles in asbestos. So perhaps the warning signs to some extent are there from just looking at the structure of the regolith itself. And that started to get the early mission planners wary, I think, about how to not only understand the potential threat of regolith, but how they could control it and how they might be able to use it in some instances. So is dust a problem? And of course, dust is a problem because, as we know, there's no atmosphere on the moon, or very, very little. Therefore, there's no surface protection from the sun. And the electrostatic forces make the regolith particles positively charged, and they stick to everything. I mean, absolutely everything. And of course, with the moon having a much weaker gravitational field than that on Earth, once it's disturbed, the dust particles tend to stay. And I was going to try and play this, but if I play it, unfortunately, the bandwidth sometimes stops the video, so I won't play it. But actually, you can find this on it's on Wikimedia, and it's a wonderful short video of the lunar rover here doing some wheel spins, and you can see that once the dust particles come up, they do stay there, and they stay there for some time. So that's telling you perhaps mentally that once the dust is disturbed, it's going to stay at least to some extent in the air that's around whatever it is that's disturbing it. So dust everywhere, and there's a few quotes here that are really useful, I think. So from 1970, after liftoff here, quote by Alan Bean, saying that dust floated freely within the cabin of the lunar module, making breathing difficult, and also enough disturbance in the module to affect vision. And Gene Cernan in 1972, really thinking that dust is the major problem. So the experience as the Apollo missions were developing was that they could overcome all of the physiological issues of traveling and living in a reduced gravity, even the psychological issues of being in close confinement, but that dust, not just to human beings, but also to the mechanics of the mission modules and the rovers, and also the equipment that was put on the surface of the moon to collect data, would be affected by the dust, and that simply turned out to be the case. So probably this is the experience that is well known, or is best known, and it's from Harrison Schmitt in 1972, and unbeknownst, of course, to the Apollo mission planners, he turned out to be extremely allergic to moon dust. So of course, how could you plan that? How could you screen that out? Probably with tests today, actually, you could screen it out, but certainly not in 1972. So he had the equivalent of space hay fever, and this was quite a serious issue for him. His eyes swelled up, he found it difficult to breathe when he was back inside the lunar module. And of course, that must be quite scary, because what can you do? You can't just go out to Superdrug. They'll have some medication available at the time, but it must have been quite scary. And thankfully, of course, it settled down and it wasn't an issue. But it did, as you can imagine, make the headlines. So dust brought into the lunar module is quite an issue here. And you can see on the left-hand side here, Edgar Mitchell in the circle, dust there on the leg of his moon suit. In the middle there, this is Eugene Cernan again, with dust on the outside of his spacesuit. And then when he takes his spacesuit off, it's a little bit blurry, this image, but dust on the long johns that they wore at the time then. And then right at the far right, this is Jack Schmitt this time, showing the presence of lunar dust on pretty much all of his spacesuit. And again, it's not a fantastically well-resolved image, but you can see, I think, pretty much from head, or at least from shoulders down to feet, there's dust clinging to his spacesuit. So some of the lunar regolith sampling that's been done starts to make us wonder about, can we do something that's a little bit more scientific and systematic to understand the nature of lunar regolith? And this wonderful picture that I think everybody uses and everybody sees is Buzz Aldrin's selfie, almost, a selfie taken by him of his lunar boot print. And of course, there's been many efforts, and I'll describe that in a moment, of lunar sample return back to Earth. And then this little vial on the right-hand side here, some lunar dust, which was actually found much later on. It was actually found in the 1990s. In somebody's cupboard, but at the time you can see the authentic writing from Apollo 11 dated back to July the 24th, 1969, when we were all young men. So what have we brought back? And what we've brought back is actually, it sounds a lot. So in the 6 Apollo missions, there's close to 400 kilograms of rocks, pebbles and dust. And there's a little bit more from 3 Soviet missions. So let's be generous, let's call it about 400 kilograms. And all of this lot, with the exception of the Soviet samples, is stored at the Johnson Space Center, which is the repository for all of the lunar samples. And it's the repository because it effectively dishes it out to many projects that request it throughout the year. But you can imagine 400 kilograms might sound a lot, and it'd be a lot if you had it dumped on your driveway, but over a period of 50 years, it's not that much if you want to do some serious scientific experiments and you want to provide the world to be able to do scientific experiments. And we'll come on to something about regoliths now, or regolith simulants. And this is work that's been done to compare and contrast what elements we find in various soil and dust samples from Earth, the lunar lowlands and the lunar highlands. And to cut a long story short, looking at the elemental distribution from hydrogen right the way down to oxygen, and you can see here that this is pretty much on a magnitude basis of relative concentration. There are some pretty good similarities between the elemental composition between the Earth samples and samples from the lunar lowlands and lunar highlands. So it might lead you to suggest that there are enough similarities perhaps in lunar dust compared with Earth dust that might lead you to think, well, maybe we can do something useful with lunar dust. When you come to look at the various porosities, so this again, this has been great fun trying to put this lot together from the various publications. This is effectively looking at the particle density and the porosity. And why does that matter? Well, that matters because it dictates how much air is present within the particles themselves, and how porous, of course, is how much water would be able to penetrate. And to cut a long story short, without going through this in too much detail, again, there are some good similarities between moon subsurface regolith and surface regolith and various different soils on Earth. So again, it might lead you to assume that the density and porosity is sufficiently similar that maybe we can do something useful with lunar regolith. So if you want more samples to work with, what we've got to do is just keep calm, and then actually think about making some. So this has spawned a great big industry over the last, at least over the last 30 years, probably even longer than that, of lunar regolith simulants. And in being able to know the elemental composition of what's been brought back from the moon has allowed scientists, material scientists, to study various source types on Earth and to be able to ultimately provide on a commercial scale some lunar regoliths simulants. And without going through them in great detail, this is just a selection of the most common. There are a few others that have been cited in the literature, but these are by and large the most common ones, and the ones that you'll see referred to again the most often, if you look on the internet and if you look in scientific publications, are these two from the Johnson Space Center, called JSC1 and JSC1A, and they differ slightly, but these are estimated to be good matches for authentic lunar regolith, and of course they allow a lot more studies to be done on Earth because you can produce this on a much larger scale because you isolate it from basaltic larvae at these various locations in the Merriam crater in San Francisco in Flagstaff. So what scientists can also do now, this was published just a couple of years ago, as you might be able to expect, is you can 3D print your own regolith. So this is an extraordinary development, and again it's been spearheaded ultimately by the Johnson Space Center, but by these folks in Germany and in the Netherlands. And it takes, if I remember rightly, it takes 30 minutes to actually produce the sample here. So this 3D printed lunar regolith 200 millimeters long, 5 millimeters in depth, will take about 30 minutes to 3D print. So again, if you're thinking about providing some substrate to be able to do some experiments with, grow plants on, look at how water flows with them, and you can't buy it, and you have a 3D printer and the materials to do it, you can actually make your own. At least that's the suggestion. So I wanted to summarize just over the last, it is pretty much over the last 50 years, what developments have happened with lunar agriculture. And this is taken right from the early Apollo missions. So up in the top left there, the Apollo missions, Apollo 11 and Apollo 12, there were some quarantine studies done on plants, and it sounds quite interesting. What's a quarantine study on a plant? Well, what scientists did is they explored what would happen to plants that had been exposed to authentic lunar regolith when it was brought back off Apollo 11 and Apollo 12. Because of course nobody at that time knew was that would there be anything bacterial or viral in lunar regolith. Chances of course would be very, very little at that time, but we didn't know. And at the same time, nobody knew what the elemental composition was at that time. So erring on the side of caution, these contamination studies were done simply to ask, would they affect plant growth? And actually they showed no effect, or very, very little effect on plant growth. So the short-term growth of plants exposed to lunar materials actually drew a complete blank. And of course, that's quite a relief. Now, what's really interesting, and it's really interesting because, again, if you think about the development of the space program and the history of where NASA was at that time and the European space agencies, there was pretty much a 30-year gap between those studies done and any attempts whatsoever to understand, at least on a serious basis, what lunar regolith would do to plant growth. And why I find that interesting is that it sort of goes hand in hand with perhaps the interest that there was at the time on moon space missions. They weren't topical after Apollo had done its bit. We've been there, we've done that. It was no doubt caught up in the politics of the time and the amount of money that was being spent at the time, but that led to a real dearth in scientific experiments done on lunar regolith. So in 2004, and then in 2014 and 2019, some studies were conducted looking at whether or not it would be possible to grow plants in lunar regolith. And these include French marigolds. And the reason that they include French marigolds is they're particularly hardy to start off with. But mission planners at the time recognized if they were serious about wanting to grow crops on the moon, then it would be of great benefit to have something that, and it sounds soft here, but something pretty would grow on the moon. Something that may have a positive physiological effect on the astronauts of the time. And that's well documented now in the NASA files, that's one of the reasons that French marigolds were chosen. So there was a gap again to looking at further plant growth on lunar regolith simulants, and then another gap looking at the first harvesting and germination study on plants grown on lunar regolith simulant. And then probably the study that really caught the public imagination, maybe for the wrong reasons rather than the right one, was China's Chang'e 4 lunar micro ecosystem, or LME, where cottonseed sprouted on the backside of the moon, on the far side of the moon. And that's a little bit misleading because what actually happened was that cotton seeds sprouted at least for I think the 4 hours that they were at a temperature that would allow them to live, not actually on the far side of the moon, but in a closed container that was landed on the back side of the moon, or on the far side of the moon. So they didn't grow on the moon, they grew, or they sprouted at least overnight, or I think it was about 4 hours. That constitutes some evidence perhaps that the conditions, at least within the micro ecosystem that the cotton seeds were contained in, would allow them to germinate. And that's pretty much it in terms of trying to understand how plants could grow on lunar regolith. So not very much, at least that's in the public domain. And I'm sure I've gone through the NASA records in some detail. There's very, very little more than this. So I thought it might be worth just spending a little bit of time going through it. So growing plants on the moon, this is taken from the 2014 paper from the Waymerlink lab. And to cut a long story short, if you look at the green blob on all of these figures, these represent on the left-hand panel germination, and on the right-hand panel average biomass of a number of different plants that fall into the categories of either occurring naturally, nitrogen fixers, or crops. And crops include wheat and rye, cress, nitrogen fixers, peas. Occurring naturally, if I remember correctly, they've used lavender, and they've also used, they've actually used nettles. And to cut a long story short, when you compare the green blob with the yellow blob, you can see pretty much in every instance that there's a decrease in the level of germination, and in most cases a decrease in the level of biomass for each of these species during this 50-day experiment. So that's the first study. The second study that was conducted was 5 years later, and in this particular study, what the scientists were looking at here is how plants would grow and germinate. This time it's on the right-hand side of the diagram, and on the left-hand side is what the biomass would be in the presence of fertilizer. So these were grown on lunar regolith simulants in a lab, but given some form of fertilizer. And it's a complex mix of fertilizer. It's not the sort of stuff that you buy at B&Q. It's a very well designed fertilizer with a number of bacterial species in it. And even in the presence of fertilizer, when compared to the germination of seeds grown in earth soil, you can see there's probably about half the crop yield in lunar regolith compared with earth soil. Some effect on seed weight and germination from lunar regolith compared with earth soil. So it's not impossible that providing some form of artificial stimulus, if you like, to lunar regolith might sustain crop growth. So that's the bottom line message from this. So lunar agriculture development, I mentioned that in the last couple of slides. Maybe just go into the detail for people who are interested. Most of the work's been done with liverwort and also with lettuce seedlings. And I think, again, because they're relatively hardy, their growth cycle is very fast. There has been some work done with supplementing marigolds with silicious bacterium, biocontrol agents, and fungi. But by and large, the studies that have been done are with very well-defined fertilizers that need to be applied to show any form of plant growth in lunar regolith simulants. So this is I put this in because I'm really sort of in awe of what China has done on its space missions. This is the first panorama view from the far side of the moon, again by the Chang'e 4's lander, and this time it's with the Yuta-2 rover. And why it's important, I think, is again when we think about the far side of the moon managing to land on that surface. I think, as we all recognise, given its pockmarked appearance, is no mean challenge. And on the right-hand side here, I find this a little bit difficult to view, but we're told here that this is a sprouting lettuce seedling grown within that lunar micro ecosystem. But hats off to the Chinese Space Agency for achieving this, because it's a great publicity coup. And if nothing else, it's what will drive competition, which will forward the field. So I think it's really a study to be applauded. So what can you do in lunar regolith? So this is some fun that we can have perhaps in the run up to Christmas. This is what lunar regolith looks like on the left-hand side. And Max Coleman here, he's been doing this over the summer because, like all of us, he's based in Florida, but like all of us, he's had not a huge amount to do during lockdown. And he's been looking at radish growth in lunar regolith simulant, again stimulated with various amounts of water but also various quantities of fertilizer. And to cut the long story short, he's been able to find just some of the right conditions that allow those radishes to germinate and to sprout. So I put the next couple of slides in because I thought this might appeal, again, especially as we're going into the Christmas season. And for any parents, grandparents that we have around, you can actually buy Lunar Regolith simulant on the internet. And you can buy it also with seeds and a little perspex container and actually try and do your own Lunar Regolith simulant growth experiment. And I'm sort of half tempted to get this myself, actually, because I'd love to see what happens. And you can also buy Martian regolith simulant as well. So if anybody's desperately short of buying a Christmas present for children, grandchildren, parents, friends, Medic Buddies, which is the website at the bottom, will I'm sure be only too keen to sell you some Lunar Regolith simulant and kits to build your own little jungle. So just for completeness, again, just in case you are desperately looking for something for Christmas, this is the Martian equivalent. And I was disappointed because when I looked at this on the website, you can see at the bottom there, currently unavailable. We don't know when this will be back in stock. And I looked actually only a couple of days ago and it's still currently unavailable. So it's either sold out very, very quickly or there wasn't that much of it there in the first place. But again, I think it's just a way of propagating the interest in science. This is a lovely idea, even if it's only slightly playful. So building habitats on the moon. So let's just imagine now that we've got our conditions right to grow crops in Lunar Regolith. What are we going to do about it? Because there's no air, as we know, on the moon. There's no protection from the sun's radiation. There's really no appreciable magnetic field and no protection from radiation. So those are the problems that everybody's well aware of, not to mention, of course, the extremes of temperature and the fact that everything, even the Apollo mission vehicles, were getting bombarded by, thankfully, micrometeorites at the time. And at least there wasn't that much damage. Although, again, if you look back through the NASA files, you can see a number of panels that have been very, very nicely damaged by meteorites. So what's the idea around building habitats? And this was published this year. So this was published in October. And it was nice timing because I was thinking, I've heard about life in lava tubes and what have you. But this is the first time I'd actually seen a systematic analysis of lava tube structure on the Earth and the Moon, and comparing some of the physiology and morphology of these tubes. So what's the basic idea? And the basic idea, and these are two lava tube holes on the surface of the Moon. The basic idea is to actually build a habitat underneath the surface of these, actually in the lava tube itself. So the diagram at the bottom is taken from the European Space Agency, and it's their initial design of what a habitat would look like. And of course, building it under the surface of the Moon gets you away from at least the radiation problem. It will get you away, at least in part, from the variation in temperature, and at least perhaps allow a more consistent domain to which to have to provide some form of heating. So there are some advantages. And then again, I don't put this up for us now, but if you're interested in looking at this, again from the European Space Agency, they've conducted a very nice video animation of what it might be like to tour through a lava tube and to exploit the structure of it for habitation, for human habitation, and also perhaps for plant growth, which leads nicely onto the concept here that NASA has put together the possibility of growing, this time it's actually in hydroponic culture. So these plants are effectively growing suspended in the air off nothing more than rock wool stimulated with nutrients and with water. And is this a possibility perhaps for the future? And the reason that this is interesting is because hydroponic agriculture has enormous impacts for feeding the underdeveloped world on Earth, and in areas where the climate is so arid, or that there aren't the availabilities of widespread fertilizers that we will take for granted, hydroponic agriculture, the day is yet to come, I think, where it will be taken seriously. But perhaps this is one way of stimulating that to happen. So just by way of a little a little summary for lunar agriculture. It's a very fine dust, it sticks to everything, it's been well studied. Plants might be able to grow in simulants, lunar regolith simulants on Earth, but would they grow on the moon? And of course the image on the right hand side, just in case you're wondering, isn't real of course, but nevertheless it's quite a poignant one. And perhaps the lunar surface might not be the best place to build a habitat, but indeed perhaps we should think about under the surface. So next part is now to think about particle distribution and particle distribution size and how it might affect human health. So this is a comparison here of some lunar regolith with lunar regolith simulants, and we're looking at the particle diameter here versus the percent fines of that particle diameter. And the bottom line is that lunar regolith simulants, excuse me, again, are pretty consistent in their particle size diameter. And the reason that that's important is that small particles will go into your lungs when you breathe in pretty much the same way that fine dust goes into your lungs if you go into your potting shed or man cave or woman cave, whatever you do at home. And if you've got dust there and you breathe it in when you've been sweeping, etc., you know it. And again, this image on the right-hand side, wonderful picture again, where you can see a hive of activity there of human footprints on authentic lunar regolith. So this is what happens to the various particles. So if you've got particles that are greater than about 5 micrometers, that's 5 millionths of a meter, they'll be deposited into your orthopharynx and swallowed. Smaller particles will reach to your lower airways, but it's the very small particles that reach to the real deep parts of the lung. They might be exhaled by tidal breathing, which is our normal breathing in and out, but then again, you don't need many of them to stay within the lower airways, perhaps to do some damage. And just to reorientate you again, on the right-hand side, these are some of the images of photomicrographs or photoelectron micrographs, in some cases photomicrographs of the particle sizes. So would you really want to be breathing those into your lungs? And I think from the history that we know of silicosis, for example, asbestosis, the disease of idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, I'm suggesting that you wouldn't. So toxicity studies, there's been a whole bunch of toxicity studies done in lab test tubes, effectively in vitro, as we call it, in human cell types. And without going through it in detail, the bottom line is that lunar dust may cause inflammation in the lung and eyes, and actually even affects nerve signaling on short-term exposure. And of course, this is short-term exposure. We don't know what would happen on long-term exposure, because those studies have never been done. But it does perhaps offer a little bit of a red flag here, that there might be some localized irritation and maybe even impairment of nerve signaling on short-term exposure to lunar dust. Same has been done in vivo studies. So these are in animals now, mainly in the rat, but one in the rabbit, again, predominantly in the lung, but in one case, looking at the eye and in the heart. And again, without going through the detail in too much, as we don't have too much time, the bottom line is that lunar dust may cause inflammation in the lung and heart, leading to lung injury and abnormal heart exposure on short abnormal heart function on short-term exposure. So again, these are studies in animals. It does allow us to be able to define what's called a lower exposure limit for which astronauts would be safe to be exposed. But knowing this is happening with lunar regolith simulants, would you really want to take that risk of breathing in lunar dust on the surface of the moon? So reporting all incidents, I couldn't resist putting this in just to keep everybody awake. because I know this is quite wordy, but it's the only way of trying to categorize all of the information that there is, and there isn't a lot. So these are all of the reports I've been able to find over the last 50 years, or published over the last 50 years. Obviously they happened in a shorter period of time, that reported sensory events associated with lunar dust. And out of all of these, there aren't that many that are possibly of major concern. So most of the astronauts reported the smell of gunpowder when they took off their helmets, having done a walk on the lunar surface. Most astronauts did, of course, report some irritation to the lung, and Harrison Schmitt with his space hay fever. But all of these were, if you like, what we might experience if we were to breathe in dust in over a short period of time. We find that gradual irritation, but after an hour or two, thankfully it subsides. So there don't appear to be any issues, at least in the short term. But of course, in the case of habitation, it's not the short term that we want to think about. So when in doubt, just keep it out. And these are some of the approaches that are being taken to try and prevent lunar dust getting into the module in the first place. Designing non-adherent spacesuits. This is a wonderful technology. Modifying the surface of the various instruments that there are within the spacecraft. Taking a CO2 shower. That sounds fun. Wouldn't mind trying that myself. But that's effectively, of course, to blast the particles off you. Using electrostatic neutralizers, curtains or guns, and there's a sparkle device, and there's one that was just published again back in October this year, and generating some next generation filters with photovoltaic electrodes, which effectively neutralize the charge on the particles. So there are some ways of perhaps preventing the dust getting in. But then if it gets in, what do you want to do? You want to be able to monitor the effects. You can look at symptoms and duration. You can actually measure, and I've mentioned this before at one of the talks I gave on space medicine, you can measure airway inflammation by using the measurement of FeNO, which stands for fraction exhaled nitric oxide. And that's simply a surrogate marker of how inflamed your lungs are. So if you have asthma, you will have FeNO probably at a level of about 25 parts per billion or greater. If you have severe asthma, you could have FeNO levels upwards of 500 parts per billion. So for people who don't have asthma, our FeNO levels would be down at about 10, 15 parts per billion, but they will go up if we inhale dust. So this is a nice marker of lung inflammation. And then there's also some work looking at developing instruments to look at neurotoxicity. But I put this one in because this is a device that's used commonly. It's used in clinical trials. We use it in our clinical trials in AstraZeneca. All companies tend to measure FeNO as a surrogate marker of lung inflammation. And of course, when you're studying drugs, you want lung inflammation to go down. And that's one of the markers that we use. So nearly got there. So Lunar Regolith, just a summary now around human health. Lunar dust may be inhaled deep into the airways, and this does pose a problem for mission planners and would pose a problem for anybody who's going to be long-term on the surface of the moon and exposed to lunar dust. It's obvious. Animal studies show that lunar simulants might cause lung injury, and probably what's the most concerning is that the animal studies that have been done are, of course, short-term. As most animal studies are, they're short-term indicators of what may happen in the long term. However, it is reassuring that a safe exposure estimate for humans has been calculated, and that's based on what we know about similar sized dust particles, which include exhaust fume studies that have been done on Earth. But as I've said at the bottom here, effects of long-term exposure on lunar dust are unknown. So are we going back to the moon? Well, this is a lovely quote here by Buzz Aldrin. I couldn't believe this when I first read it, because what he says is basically, guys, pack your bags up and don't bother. Let's do something that's a little bit more interesting. So I bet Buzz was popular when he posted this, particularly as NASA is pushing, or was pushing, and is pushing the Artemis mission for going back to the moon. But perhaps a little bit more balanced, no doubt very politically astute, Jack Schmidt's comment at the Lunar Dust Symposium: a common sense layered engineering defense approach can pretty much solve anything. And perhaps when you think of the developments of technology that there are for preventing dust getting into the cabin and the surface of space vehicles, let alone studying the effect of dust on what it can do if it's inhaled or gets into the eyes, perhaps Jack Schmidt's approach is a little bit more objective, and perhaps a little bit more realistic, because as we all know, within any form of exploration, there comes a risk associated with it. So I just want to finish up with a couple of images. This one, I thought, this is just fantastic. I mean, this was taken in 1970, 50 years ago, and just look at the resolution of that. And I love I can imagine the purposeful stride of this astronaut here. And I don't know who he is, but it's just, I'm off to the pub. You know, it's a wonderful image, I think. And this to me looks like and I know, of course, he's collecting lunar samples here, but you might imagine this is somebody who's been to the pub and he's back on the way home. But again, an absolutely wonderful image. And then lastly, I can't resist following up with this one. And again, thank you, everybody. And I think we're just about on time.